Somewhere, right now, a wire transfer is clearing. Hundreds of millions of dollars, moving from one account to another. And on the other end of that transfer is something almost nobody on Earth will ever own. Not a house, not a company, not even a private jet. An entire airline, every aircraft, every pilot, every gate agent, every landing slot at every airport in the network. All of it, now, belongs to one person. For about 10 seconds, it feels incredible. Then the first bill arrives. And the second, and the third, because here is the part nobody tells you before you buy an airline. The moment you sign the paperwork, you are already losing money. Before a single wheel leaves the tarmac. Before a single ticket is sold. This is the strange, brutal, almost irrational economics of owning an airline, and by the end of this, you'll understand exactly why the skies are ruled by companies that make less profit per customer than a fast food restaurant. Owning an airline sounds like the closest thing to owning a small country. Your name on the tail of the plane. Your logo on 10,000 boarding passes a day. A private terminal lounge with your face, quietly, somewhere on the wall. It is the ultimate symbol of arrival, bigger than a yacht, rarer than a sports team, more visible than almost any other asset a person can hold. And historically, this fantasy has pulled in some of the richest men alive. Billionaires who already had everything, hotels, media empires, oil fields, and still wanted one more thing, wings. Richard Branson didn't need Virgin Atlantic to get richer. He wanted the version of himself that owned an airline. Howard Hughes, one of the wealthiest men of the 20th century, poured himself into TWA not because the numbers made sense, but because flight itself was the obsession. That's the pull. Airlines are not really bought with a calculator. They're bought with ego. And for a moment, let's stay in that fantasy, because it's important to understand it before we tear it apart. Imagine the scale of what you'd actually control. A single wide-body aircraft carries close to 300 people at once, 35,000 feet above the ground, at nearly the speed of sound, safely, thousands of times a year. You would command a fleet of these. A small air force of steel and jet fuel, moving human beings across oceans on your schedule. It is, without exaggeration, one of the most powerful things a private citizen can own. Which is exactly why what comes next is so hard for new owners to accept. Because everything about owning an airline feels like power. And almost nothing about the accounting behind it is power. It is one of the most punishing, thin-margin, unforgiving businesses that money can buy into. Let's start with the very first check you have to write, long before you own a single plane. You cannot simply buy an airline the way you buy a company. You have to be allowed to fly one. Every country on Earth requires what's called an Air Operator Certificate, an AOC. It is, in effect, a license to operate aircraft commercially, and it does not come cheap or fast. Just obtaining the certificate itself, before you've bought a single plane, typically costs somewhere between $1 and $3 million in legal fees, safety documentation, and regulatory review. Aviation authorities don't hand this out to just anyone with money. They demand proof of competent management, proof of adequate financing, and a written operations manual so detailed it can run into thousands of pages, covering everything from how you'll respond to an engine fire to how you'll train a single flight attendant. This process alone can take 12 to 24 months. 2 full years where you are spending money, hiring aviation lawyers, hiring former airline executives to sit on your leadership team, and not flying a single paying passenger. And that's before the real capital requirement even enters the picture. Depending on the scale of the airline you want to build, total startup capital can range from around $10 million for a tiny regional operation with a couple of aircraft, all the way past $300 million for a full-service international carrier with a real fleet. When JetBlue launched in the year 2000, it secured roughly $130 million before its first flight ever took off. When Virgin America launched, the number was closer to $300 million. Breeze Airways, founded by JetBlue's own founder decades later, still needed about $100 million just to get off the ground. Read those numbers again. These are some of the most experienced airline builders alive, with decades of industry connections, and they still needed 9 figures, minimum, before they earned a single dollar of revenue. Now here's the number that should genuinely unsettle you. EOS Airlines launched with an estimated $200 million in initial investment. A serious, well-funded, professionally run airline. It collapsed anyway, within a few short years. $200 million. Gone. And EOS is not a rare story, it's closer to the industry norm. So before a plane, before a pilot, before a passenger, you've already spent enough money to buy a professional sports team outright, purely for the right to try. The airline business doesn't ask, can you afford to buy in? It asks, can you afford to fail, repeatedly, and keep going? Assuming you clear that first wall, now you actually have to buy the planes. A single, modern narrow-body jet, the kind you've flown on dozens of times without thinking twice, has a manufacturer's list price north of $120 million. That's for the midsize version of a plane like the Boeing 737 MAX. Step up to the larger variants, and the sticker price pushes past $130 million. And that's before you've bought a single wide-body aircraft for long-haul international routes, where prices can climb toward $200, $300, even $400 million for a single airframe. Here's the twist almost nobody outside the industry knows. Nobody actually pays that price. List prices are closer to a fiction. A starting number for negotiation, the aviation equivalent of a sticker price on a car lot. In reality, airlines routinely negotiate discounts of 40 to 60% off list, especially on large orders. So that jet quoted at $120 million might genuinely change hands for $50 or $60 million once the real contract is signed. It's a hidden, secretive market. Boeing and Airbus don't publish what anyone actually pays, and airlines guard those numbers as fiercely as any trade secret. But even at a discounted $50 or $60 million per aircraft, remember, you need more than one. A functioning airline, even a small one, needs a fleet. 5 aircraft, 10, 20. The moment you multiply that per plane cost by a fleet size large enough to build real routes and real frequency, you're talking about a capital commitment that rivals building a skyscraper. This is precisely why most airlines don't actually buy their planes outright. They lease them. Leasing a single modern narrow-body aircraft can run around $400,000 a month. That sounds enormous, and it is. But compared to tying up $50 to $70 million in cash per aircraft, it's often the only realistic path. It's why so many airlines you fly today don't technically own the majority of their fleet. They're renting the sky, one contract at a time, from specialized aircraft leasing companies most passengers have never heard of. And leasing doesn't remove the risk, it just reshapes it. Miss a payment, and the lessor can, in the right circumstances, reclaim the aircraft. Your entire route network can be built on assets you don't actually control. So picture where we are now. You've spent $1 to $3 million just for the legal right to fly. You've committed tens of millions more, purchased or leased, for a fleet large enough to be taken seriously. You have pilots to hire, at salaries that can run into 6 figures per captain, plus flight attendants, plus mechanics, plus gate staff at every single airport you touch. And you still haven't sold a single ticket. Now let's talk about what happens after you finally start flying, because this is where the real horror story begins. Let's say you did it. The certificate is approved, the fleet is secured, pilots are trained. Today, your airline flies its first commercial flight, fully booked, every seat sold. You would think this is the moment the money finally starts flowing toward you. It isn't. It's the moment it starts flowing away from you, in more directions than you can count. Start with fuel. Jet fuel alone typically eats up around 30% of an airline's entire operating budget, the single largest expense category in the business, and one you have almost no control over. You don't set the price of oil. A war on the other side of the planet, a refinery accident, a currency shift, any of it can silently reshape your entire cost structure overnight, and there is nothing you can do about it except watch. Then comes maintenance, roughly another 10 to 12% of your budget. Every aircraft in your fleet requires scheduled inspections, parts replacement, engine overhauls that can individually cost millions of dollars, and in scheduled repairs that arrive without warning and without mercy. An aircraft grounded for repairs isn't just costing you maintenance fees, it's a multi-million-dollar asset sitting completely idle, earning nothing, while its lease payment keeps arriving like clockwork. Then crew costs, another 10 to 11%. Pilots, especially senior captains on long-haul international routes, command genuinely high salaries, and rightly so. They hold hundreds of lives in their hands on every single flight. Add flight attendants, ground crew, dispatchers, and the payroll for a mid-size airline can run into the hundreds of millions of dollars annually, every single year, whether your planes are full or half empty. Then airport costs, landing fees, gate rental, ground handling. At major hub airports, these fees alone can represent a meaningful slice of your route's total cost, and at the world's most congested airports, you may not even be allowed to land without buying or leasing a takeoff and landing slot, some of which have sold for tens of millions of dollars in private transactions, simply for the right to use a runway at a specific hour of the day. Then insurance, then catering, then IT systems, then marketing, because in a market this competitive, silence means irrelevance. Then interest payments on every dollar you borrowed to get here in the first place. By the time you add it all up, fuel, maintenance, crew, airports, insurance, debt, you begin to understand something almost paradoxical about this industry. You can run a fully booked, professionally managed, genuinely excellent airline, and still watch nearly every dollar that comes in the front door leave again through a dozen different doors before it ever reaches you. And that brings us to the number that explains everything else about this business. The number that decides why your airline nickel and dimes you for a checked bag. Why the seats keep shrinking. Why boarding feels more chaotic every single year. After every single one of those costs is paid, fuel, maintenance, crew, airports, insurance, debt, here is what's actually left over, per passenger, on the average airline, in a good year for the industry. About $7.90. Not 700. Not 70. $7.90. Roughly the price of a fast food combo meal. Is the average net profit an airline earns per person it flies, anywhere on Earth, on an average ticket. Across the entire global industry, net profit margins sit at under 4%. For comparison, that's less than half the average profitability of most other industries combined. Let that sit for a second, because it reframes everything you thought you understood about the airline business. That $500 ticket you bought for your last vacation? After fuel, after the pilot's salary, after the landing fee, after the lease payment on the aircraft, after maintenance, after insurance, the airline is walking away with pocket change. Multiply that by hundreds of millions of passengers a year, and yes, the total dollar figure looks enormous on a headline. Tens of billions of dollars in profit, industry-wide. But spread that same profit across every single seat, on every single flight, and it nearly evaporates. This single fact explains almost every frustrating thing about modern air travel. Why bag fees exist. Why legroom keeps shrinking. Why loyalty programs and credit card partnerships have quietly become more profitable for some airlines than flying the actual planes. Why a single bad quarter, a fuel spike, a pilot strike, a geopolitical shock, a pandemic, can push even a massive, famous airline to the edge of bankruptcy within months. You are not in the business of flying planes. You are in the business of surviving on razor-thin margins at a scale most human beings can't intuitively grasp. Where being off by 1% on your cost structure can be the difference between a record profit and a company-ending loss. And that fragility is exactly what has killed some of the most famous airline names in history. The airline industry has one of the highest failure rates of any capital-intensive business on Earth. And it isn't because the people running these companies are careless. Some of the sharpest operators in aviation history have watched their airlines collapse anyway. EOS Airlines, which we mentioned earlier, launched with roughly $200 million and an all-business class model that, on paper, looked brilliant. It didn't survive. Virgin America, backed by hundreds of millions in capital and a genuinely beloved brand among flyers, was eventually absorbed by a competitor rather than surviving independently. Pan Am, once the single most glamorous name in aviation, the airline that quite literally defined what international air travel looked like for decades, filed for bankruptcy and ceased operations entirely in the early 1990s, undone by a combination of fuel shocks, debt, and a security disaster it never financially recovered from. TWA, Howard Hughes's obsession, the airline he poured a fortune and years of his life into, also eventually collapsed into bankruptcy and was absorbed into a rival carrier. Notice the pattern. These weren't underfunded startups run by amateurs. These were airlines with real capital, real brand recognition, real operational excellence, undone by the same handful of forces, again and again. A sudden spike in fuel prices. A debt load that became unmanageable the moment revenue dipped even slightly. A shock to global travel demand nobody could have priced into their model. Or simply years of thin margins finally catching up all at once. This is the part of the fantasy that never makes it into the glossy brochure. You are not just building a business. You are building a business with almost no margin for error. An enormous fixed cost structure that keeps billing you whether your planes fly full or empty. And total exposure to global events completely outside your control. Oil prices set by geopolitics on the other side of the planet. Pandemics, wars, recessions, currency collapses. A restaurant that has a bad month can quietly ride it out. An airline that has a bad quarter can be forced to ground its fleet, default on lease payments, and watch 100 years of institutional history evaporate in a matter of weeks. The business doesn't forgive mistakes. It barely forgives bad luck. And yet, despite every one of these numbers, despite every cautionary tale, new airlines keep launching. Billionaires keep buying in, which raises the real question this whole story has been building toward. If the math is this brutal, why does anyone with real financial sense still choose to own an airline? The honest answer is, most of them aren't doing the math the way you and I just did. They're buying something the spreadsheet can't fully capture. An airline is one of the most visible brands a human being can own. It's not a factory hidden behind a fence somewhere. It's a logo painted across the sky, seen by millions of people a year, landing at the most prestigious airports on Earth, photographed, tracked, talked about. For a certain kind of owner, that visibility is the return on investment. Not the $7.90 of profit per passenger. The power of controlling a piece of critical global infrastructure. The relationships it opens with governments and business leaders in every country it touches. The sheer, undeniable statement it makes about who you are. There's also a quieter, more strategic version of this. For some owners, the airline isn't really the business. It's the connective tissue for a much larger empire. It moves your cargo. It supports your tourism resorts. It ties directly into a hotel chain, a logistics network, a media company that benefits from having a captive audience of passengers for hours at a time. On its own, the airline may barely break even. As one piece of a much bigger machine, it can quietly make everything else more valuable. And then there's the simplest explanation of all, the one that goes back to Howard Hughes, and Richard Branson, and every founder who's ever poured a fortune into a fleet of aircraft. Some people don't buy airlines because the numbers make sense. They buy them because, for their entire lives, nothing has made them feel more powerful than watching a plane with their name on it lift off the ground. That's not a financial decision. That's a human one. So if you're the kind of person who's ever fantasized about owning an airline, here's the honest version of that dream. You will spend $1 to $3 million just to be allowed to try. You will need somewhere between $10 million and $300 million in real capital before your first paying passenger boards. You will fight for margins so thin that $7.90 per person is considered a good year. And you will do all of this fully aware that some of the most well-funded, well-run airlines in history still didn't survive it. And somehow, people keep buying anyway. Maybe that's the real lesson hiding inside all of this. Not every asset on Earth is bought for what it returns. Some things are bought for what they mean. An airline, more than almost anything else money can buy, sits exactly on that line. A business that can bankrupt even brilliant people, and a symbol powerful enough that brilliant people keep buying it anyway. So the next time you're sitting in seat 14C, complaining about the legroom, or the delay, or the $40 bag fee, remember what's actually happening underneath you. An entire, fragile, multi-billion-dollar machine, built on razor-thin margins, kept in the air by thousands of decisions made correctly, over and over, every single day, just so you can get where you're going. It is one of the strangest businesses on Earth. And now, you understand exactly why. If you learned something from this, subscribe, because next time, we're breaking down what it actually costs to own something even stranger.